Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thank you for offering me the opportunity to say a few words today about some aspects of the future supervisory and regulatory landscape. And I will speak from the perspective, from the global perspective, not from the Russian perspective, from the global perspective. Well, the world went through a very serious financial crisis, and in some parts of the world this crisis is still going on. I think we all want a strong and resilient financial system. That is quite clear. Our societies have sent the clear message that they never want to see again a crisis as the one that started in 2007, 2008. But honestly speaking, this is easier said than done. Deep in our hearts, we know that new crises will come again. But let's try to minimize at least the likelihood and adverse effects of these new crises. That is what the Basel rules, the new Basel rules of the game, are aiming at. I have to say, Basel III is only part of the answer to the crisis. There's much more, for example, much better macroeconomic policies should play a role too, as well as changes in the institutional setup of supervision. One of the issues under discussion here in Russia. Well, for a resilient financial system, we need, that is self-evident, we need strong banks, we need decent bankers, let's not forget that. We need good regulators, and we need an adequate regulatory framework. This sounds trivial, admittedly, this sounds trivial, but realizing these interdependent, because they are to a very large extent interdependent, these conditions, these interdependent conditions, realizing them is not at all easy. Well, if I look at the picture from a certain distance, and I said I'm looking at the global picture, then financial institutions have a hell of a job in front of them. They are operating in a very uncertain environment. In some countries the environment is even more uncertain than in others, but in the world as a whole, I think economic situation is rather uncertain, and banks and bankers have sunk dramatically on whatever popularity lists. 10 years ago, it was the doctor, and in my country, the priest. They were number one, number two, and the banker, more or less ex equo, number 1, 2, or 3. Nowadays, it's different. If you look at the popularity list in the United States, they are even after internal revenue, and that is the most less popular institution in the United States, the tax collector. So, and the number of them, I said they are not very popular at this very moment, bankers, but a number of them, the banks, are all still suffering under the effects of the financial crisis. And at the same time, and this is the issue, at the same time they have to adjust to the new regulatory and supervisory environment. And there is no escape from that. I had endless discussions, by the way, with bankers all over the world. They thought in the beginning, when we started the Basel III discussions, and they thought that they could escape the new regime, that it was not necessary, but there is no escape from the new regime and the new regulatory and supervisory environment. Simply resuming business and behavior as usual is, to my mind, impossible. And for a number of banks, a fundamental review of the business model is needed. Much more than in the past, supervisors will therefore have to pay attention to the strategy and the business models of banks. Banks don't like that. This is what I have learned as a supervisor. Banks don't like that supervisors become involved in their strategies and in their business model. But having said that, supervisors will pay more attention than in the past to business models. But at the same time, I have to add that they should not, of course, decide on these strategies and on these models. And the corporate governance of financial institutions should also be high on the agenda of supervisors and of banks. The reason being that the risk profile of a financial institution to a very large extent depends on the behavior and the integrity of the board, the so-called culture of a financial institution. But it not only depends on the behavior and integrity of its board, but also on the structure of the company, on the checks and balances in the system, and on the incentives for the staff. And when I say incentives for the staff, the responsible remuneration policies, including bonus systems, should get a prominent place on the priority list too. If bankers ever, and I'm expressing a feeling, not only in my own country, but also in the United Kingdom and in the United States and in other parts of the world, if bankers ever want to be trusted again, they should fundamentally change their behavior and restore the ethical reputation of the financial sector. So, one of the main tasks of regulators and supervisors in the years ahead is to closely monitor how banks are adjusting to this new environment. But supervisors, admittedly, supervisors should also assess their own functioning. The relationship among banks, supervisors, and by the way, central banks has always been rather complex and is even more complex nowadays, more complex than in the past as a consequence of the financial crisis. From perhaps being too close to the financial sector, too cozy, they are becoming, a number of supervisors, perhaps too aggressive to the financial sector. So what we should try and do is to find a balanced mix of a more inclusive and better supervision, and what we should try and find is a better cooperation between supervisors and financial institutions. As to supervision and supervisors, I would like to say the following. The starting point for good supervision are, that is self-evident, the BAL core principles for effective supervision. But these are very high-level principles, very high level, and they should be made as concrete as possible. Wienals, I don't know whether you know this study, Wienals and Fichter's study published a few years ago under the title Learning to Say No, can be helpful in this context. In their view, good supervision is intrusive, adaptive, critical, persistent. And they also make the very useful distinction between the ability to act and the will to act. Admittedly, these concepts are not very revolutionary, but they have given us in the Netherlands, in the central bank in the Netherlands, is at the same time the prudential supervisor, they have given us in the Netherlands a helpful stimulus to reflect in a very structured way on the necessary conditions for good and effective supervision in practice, including the organizational consequences, because we have to realize the structure of our supervision. Good supervision also requires much more international cooperation, and I think important steps have been taken by the creation of the so-called colleges of supervisors inside and outside Europe. But these colleges can only succeed if all participants have the right mindset, being more than willing to exchange views, to exchange information. And here I'm speaking from my personal experience as a supervisor. I was very much involved in the takeover of ABN AMRO by 3 other banks, and at a certain moment I was involved in getting back ABN AMRO, making ABN AMRO again an independent bank, take over by the Dutch government. But at the moment we were negotiating with the other parties involved. We didn't know that the British supervisor, for example, was providing ELA, emergency liquidity assistance, to one of the parts of the 3 banks that had taken over ABN AMRO. So there was no exchange of views between the supervisors during all these discussions, and that is bad, and that is one of the things we should try and change. And this is one of the reasons that we have set up these colleges. And as I said, these colleges can only succeed if all participants have the right mindset. But we should go further. In a number of countries, the institutional setup of supervision has been changed. In the UK, for example, also in the United States, or is under discussion, as is the case in, I think, in this country. And Europe is on the verge of making a quantum leap with respect to supervision. It is highly likely that legislation establishing a single supervisory mechanism with the European Central Bank at its center will be enacted in March 2013, and a year later, as of March 2014, the ECB will acquire full supervisory authority. Let me now turn to the main theme of my introduction, Basel III and its implications for the future financial and regulatory landscape. Before 2007, we were hearing quite a bit about the benefits of light touch regulation, the originate to distribute model, financial innovation, etc., etc. In 2006, before the crisis, the Basel Committee had already on its radar screen some what we called at that time pressure points. I have in mind securitizations and risk concentrations. And the committee revised subsequently the Basel II rules. But as the crisis deepened, we became more and more aware of the primacy of sufficient high quality, I have to add, high quality capital and liquidity, and of the leverage of financial institutions. So we started to discuss these aspects, and after about 2 years, these discussions ended up in Basel III. And to my mind, a very interesting thing is that Basel III included a non-risk-based leverage ratio, an approach that almost unanimously was rejected in the Merida meeting of the committee just a few years earlier in 2006. Only, I don't know whether you know her, familiar with her name, she was the chairman of the FDIC, but only Sheila Bair was strongly advocating for such a ratio. And the rest of the committee was vehemently against the introduction of a leverage ratio. And I remember that our Swiss colleague, for example, said that if we would introduce a leverage ratio, then we would go back to medieval times. It's a Stone Age approach. And some other members said that the introduction of a leverage ratio wouldn't be compatible with Basel II, because Basel II is a risk-based approach. It is, by the way, fascinating to read Sheila Bair's side of the story. This book was published, I think, 6 months ago or so. To read her side of the story in Bull by the Horns. But during our analyses of the financial crisis in Basel, so after 2007, it became clear to, let me say, almost all of us that over-leverage was a distinctive criterion, more distinctive even than risk-weighted capital, that was a distinctive criterion in assessing whether and why a financial institution had run into problems. As you all know, the Basel III framework was the cornerstone of the G20 regulatory reform agenda. But at the same time, it was part of a much broader project in which the Financial Stability Board has had the lead. And now I have in mind, for example, crisis resolution mechanisms, the treatment of CFIs, these important financial system, important financial institutions, important for the system as a whole, and the remuneration issues. And apart from that, there were all kinds of national initiatives focusing on more country-specific factors. As for Basel III, we can safely say that the Basel Committee rules, and now I'm quoting a report, McKinsey report, the Basel Committee rules are, quote unquote, more than just another set of checks and balances for financial institutions in the post-crisis world. The Basel Committee package represents the core component of a sweeping wave of regulation that will fundamentally affect the profit generation capacity of the banking industry. I'll come back to that profit generation capacity. But just as critical as the policy development, is consistent, global and timely implementation. And the Basel Committee has initiated a strong review procedure, much stronger than we had in the past. And in the past, this approach, the approach we introduced nowadays, and that is peer pressure. The Japanese, for example, the United States supervisor, they go to China just to check whether China is complying with the new rules of the game. And this is, to my mind, this is really progress in the supervisory field. In the past, this approach was seen as too intrusive and not acceptable membership of the committee. Having said this all, there are no guarantees that the major economic blocs in the world will exactly copy the Basel III framework. And there are already, admittedly, implementation delays. According to a very recent report of the Financial Stability Board, uneven headway has been made, and less than 1/3 of the big financial centers will have Basel III rules in place on time. That is the 1st of January of 2030. But fortunately, to my mind, this has been expressed by the present chairman of the Basel Committee also recently. Fortunately, the issue is not if the reforms will be implemented, but when. And recently, the Basel Committee members have again expressed their full commitment to implementing Basel III. In assessing the delays, one should keep in mind that the introduction of Basel III takes place against the background of very uncertain economic circumstances, especially but not alone in Europe. The apparent slowing down of economic growth in the industrialized world and the sovereign risk crisis in Europe are complicating factors, making the introduction of higher capital requirements on the one hand more difficult, but on the other hand also more necessary. This being said, the Basel III Tier 1 capital ratio for a number of major banks, and I saw the figures recently for the United States, this capital ratio is already between 8 and 9%, and the leverage ratio in the United States is even much higher than the 3 that has been advised by the Basel Committee. But I have to admit at the same time that a number of European banks are at the end of 2012 still below the figure agreed upon, that is the 3 I mentioned. But progress has been made, that is quite clear also. And it's interesting to note, and I think it's relevant also for you, that the deleveraging of the financial sector in Europe hasn't come at the expense of credits to the private sector. At least I have to exclude Portugal, Spain, the debt-ridden countries that are in great problems at the moment. But in the other countries, the introduction of Basel III, the increase in capital ratios that has taken place already, hasn't come, as I said, at the expense of credit to the private sector. Is Basel III, that is a very relevant question, of course, is Basel III the final answer to all the problems we have been confronted in the banking sector? I remember Charles Goodhart once said that any fool can make banks safer. Any fool can make banks safer. And I think he's right. Because you can do that by raising capital requirements, introducing a leverage ratio, by introducing appropriate liquidity requirements. But there is a cost, of course, to regulation. So there is a limit to the extent you can make banks safer. So now, Charles Goodhart is right. The Basel Committee has been fully aware of the trade-offs between more expensive intermediation and a safer banking system. And the BIS and the Basel Committee and the IMF and other central banks also did quite a lot of research in this area. And all these institutions concluded, and I think more than 100 models have been used during the research on this institution. All these institutions concluded that during the transition period, the negative impact on economic growth would be minimal, and the impact on our economies in the longer term, in the steady state, would become very, very positive. Well, I already asked myself, is Basel III as it stands the final answer to the weaknesses in the banking system? Obviously not. That is something. There is still much work to be done. And the Basel Committee has included, and rightly so, in its future work program, important issues such as the fundamental review of the trading book, issues as how to reduce the reliance on external ratings, cross-border banking resolution, large exposure rules, risk weights, including the treatment of sovereigns. For me, the most shocking example of what can go wrong with risk weights is the treatment of debt issued by weak sovereigns such as Greece, Portugal, etc. Because Basel II treated these investments as having zero risks. But the risk weights issue is much broader. For the same category of assets, these weights can differ from country to country. Absolutely not always justified by country-specific circumstances. Some countries also supervise things that their real estate sector is more stable than the real estate sector in a neighboring country. Till something happens. The Basel Committee has been investigating this issue for the banking book as well for the trading book, and it will report, I saw in a recent speech by its chairman, it will report on its findings for the trading book shortly. And as far as I have understood from that recent speech, there is material, this is important, there is material variation in risk weights for trading assets across banks, with as important drivers of this variation certain model choices. And in the same speech, Mr. Ingves also mentioned that the quality of existing public disclosure is generally insufficient. Well, there's quite a lot of work to do in this area, that is clear. We will never get the risk weights right, but that's not a reason, completely right, but that's not a reason to abandon this approach completely and only work with a simple leverage ratio, as some of our American friends are promoting. Such a one-size-fits-all approach would mean walls that are too small for one place and too high for another, and therefore imply substantial costs for society at large. The right approach, to my mind, is an intelligent combination of a risk-weighted approach with certain limitations, and the Basel Committee should study on that, with certain limitations as to the variation in risk weights. Such an approach combined with a sufficiently binding leverage ratio. And basically, this is what the Basel tries to realize. Let me, by the way, make a side remark. There is a danger that, as a consequence of the tighter regulation, the most assertive risk-taking will shift out of the regulated institutions. The regulators and supervisors will therefore have to closely monitor this development, especially because the 2007-2008 crisis was partly due to the rapid growth of the poorly regulated segments of our financial system, segments that are not subject to capital requirements, and did not have also did not have access to the central bank's lender of last resort facility. But having said this, it should not be, and that is my firm conviction, it should not be the regulator's ambition to mobilize a cap for every household. That shouldn't be the ambition of a supervisor. The FSB, as you may know, the FSB is working on the shadow banking sector, seeking comments on consultative documents published in November last year, documents on strengthening oversight and regulation of shadow banking. The regulators and supervisors should focus their attention, to my mind, especially on the incentives of players in the markets. I mentioned already remuneration policies, but also be aware that what at first sight seems logical from the perspective of an individual institution, what seems logical from that perspective and risk minimizing might turn out to be risk increasing for the system as a whole. To give you one example, but it's a controversial example, admittedly. Ring fencing is popular in some circles and countries nowadays, but it might happen as a consequence of ring fencing and creating, how do you call that, narrow, safe banks. What might happen is that a strong incentive is given to banking outside these safe banks due to the higher rate of return of the lender institution. So ring fencing might, in the longer run, result in a less resilient and less stable financial system. BaFin, that is the German supervisor, has recently asked banks to assess the effects of splitting trading activities into a separate unit. And what I remember from the Basel Committee's quantitative impact study is that on balance, universal banks weathered the financial storm better than specialized banks. I say on balance because it is, of course, also a matter of degree to what extent a universal bank is involved in investment activities. And the economy report published last year introduces a kind of threshold for trading activities. Well, I think what I should do is I should skip what I wanted to say about CFIs because I do not want to speak too long, and I should go through some implications of the Basel regime, the new Basel regime for banks. Compared to the present situation, the introduction of the new regulatory rules imply that major gaps, really major gaps, have to be closed as to Tier 1 capital, short-term liquidity, long-term funding, with potentially substantial implications for profitability of the banking sector. And bankers are complaining about it. What they are basically saying is we are ruining the profitability of our sector. But what they tend to forget is that the profitability was due to the fact that the risks involved are not taken into account. And it all well, boiled down to resulted in a crisis, and crises are extremely expensive. Bankers tend to forget that how expensive the financial crisis is. We make calculations in the context also the development of the new bar rules and take the conclusion that on average every 25 years, at random speaking, a financial crisis will take place in an individual country. And the cost of these crises amount to 16, and this is a cumulative figure. This is the figure compared to what would have happened otherwise. The loss in terms of GDP ranges from 16% of GDP to more than 100%, so financial crises are expensive. And you should not focus too much on short-term profitability. You should also include the long-term consequences. The Bauer Committee came to the conclusion that its proposals are feasible, but what at the end of the day the impact will be on the return on equity of individual banks depends to a very large extent, this is self-evident, on the reaction pattern of the bank's management. I've seen the results of the McKinsey study suggesting a 4 percentage point reduction on average in the ROE of European banks and a reduction of 3 percentage points in the ROE of US banks, but these calculations, as I said already, are very much assumptions dependent. Directionally, I think they are correct. Banking is going into a new phase of thinner margins and slower growth. Taking into account the nature of the Bauer package and its underlying intentions, it will come as no surprise that investment banks will be hit hardest via the securitization and trading part of the business. And don't forget that these investment banks are also confronted with Dodd-Frank in the US and the figures and the accounting proposals in the UK and the EU. By the way, proposals that fall outside the mandate of the Bauer Committee. It was a very difficult give and take process in Bauer. And at the end of the process, nobody was perfectly happy. But the result, I think, the result was as good as it could be. In my view, it was a balanced result. Well, as to the question, how can banks survive in this new environment of less profitability? Part of the answer is balance sheet restructuring and a better capital and liquidity management, supported by strong central treasury functions. Here, I think, for many international banks, there is still scope for improvement. Cutting costs is also a self-evident and necessary, but not sufficient condition. Much to, I think, the investment bankers' chagrin, cost reduction is bound to extend through pay levels also. And in some cases, when the competitive environment allows for such approach, pricing adjustments can mitigate the impact of Basel III. But in a number of cases, I think a fundamental rethinking of the business model of banks is inevitable. My personal feeling is that also a lot has been done. Many banks are in a better shape than a few years ago. Too many banks at this very moment are focusing, understandably, on today's problems, trying to survive the present crisis, but paying not enough attention to strategic longer-term issues. Banks should reflect on these longer-term issues and therefore on their business model, so as to create more capital and liquidity-efficient financial institutions. In addition, banks should try and rebuild trust in them and in the sector as a whole. Getting the business model right is one thing, but it should at least include more customer focus and a better eye for what societies expect from their financial institutions, including transparent and balanced remuneration policies. After all, the shocking drop in confidence levels was to a very large extent due to remuneration issues. Well, let me look. Can I continue or should I stop now? Okay.
How can we stop you? This is good.
You can stop me every moment. Let me then say a few words of. Is the next speaker already available? He is. So then I think I should be polite and not speak too long anymore. But let me say a few words then on financial market implications. During the developments of the Basel III framework, the committee's studies estimated that the additional demand for equity by worldwide banks would be around 600 billion euro for the 70% requirement. And this estimate excludes, and this is a 2009 figure, this estimate excludes the effects of changes in risk-weighted assets and revenues earned since 2009 and future bank revenues. But we thought it's feasible. It's a big amount, but it's feasible because bank equity issuance has been between 50 and 100 to 150 billion annually since 2005. But okay, it is a hell of a job, and especially for European banks. Bond markets may be affected by changing preferences for banks to hold certain asset classes. The LCR, the liquidity coverage ratio, as you know, aims to ensure that banks can survive a 30-day liquidity stress environment with limited support from central banks. I think the LCR is a good idea. But recently, the decisions have been taken with respect to the LCR, boiling down to a certain weakening of the LCR approach. Banks will be allowed to pick from a longer list of approved assets, including the selection of listed equities and highly rated securitized mortgage debt. And they have got more years to meet the LCR requirements. Honestly speaking, I have some problems not with the change in the definition of liquid assets, but I have some problems with respect to the introduction of a longer transition period. Because the transition period, it all starts in 2015 and goes on through 2019. Why do I have problems with the long transition period? Because at this very moment, for the world's largest banks, the LCR amounts already to 125%. That is for the 200 largest. And according to the new regime, they can start from a level of 60 and then go to 100, and they have to reach that figure of 100% in 2019. And what basically happened is that we are accommodating the weakest banks in Europe. And this became visible immediately. Stock market, Italian banks, Spanish banks, the shares went up much more than I think was in line with the underlying strength of these banks. This being said, I think it's fair to note, to quote Mervyn King, who rightly said, for the first time in recorded history, we have a truly global minimum standard for banks' liquidity. So on balance, I'm positive about the LCR, but I think the introduction period is on the very low side. Well, let me conclude. The crisis 2007-2008 that started in the US quickly spilled over to many other countries. The trend towards globalization and ever more rapid financial innovation implies that future shocks will be transmitted even more quickly than in the past. I think this is a very important what I'm saying. And I'm not often saying this of what I'm saying, but this is a very important thing. Crises will spill over more quickly than in the past. The consequence being that we will have more crises than in the past. The dampening effect of national barriers has disappeared, and it's therefore crucial that all countries increase the capital and liquidity buffers of their banking system to the agreed levels, and that all these countries reduce when necessary the leverage of their financial institutions. There are, as I said before, limited short-term costs to the introduction of the new regulatory regime, but in the steady state, Basel III will have substantial beneficial effects on our economies and on financial markets. The Basel Committee, let me end with just a few figures. The Basel Committee has estimated that an increase in the bank's capital of 2 percentage points of risk-weighted assets will more than halve the risk of a crisis. More than half the risk of a crisis. This is of utmost importance because financial crises are extremely expensive, and I mentioned already cumulative GDP losses ranging from 16% of GDP to more than 100%. And if liquidity risk is also reduced, in addition to what I said about capital, the probability of a crisis declines even more. And the reduced default risk of banks will lower credit risk premium they have to pay in capital markets. And in addition, a stronger banking system is expected to have a positive impact on market confidence, reducing thus the volatility in financial markets. So there's a lot to say for the introduction of Basel II/Basel III. It will make our financial systems more resilient. We will, as I said in the beginning, have crises in the future again, but of a different nature, I assume. And I think in the context of what I said, we also, and the bankers will also have to accept the pressure on the rate of return on equity. And the bankers have also accept that they should have a closer eye to what societies expect from them. Well, thank you very much for your patience. And I shortened my text a little bit, so perhaps I became a little bit less structured during the second part of my introduction, but I didn't want you to suffer too much under what I wanted to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.